I'm thrilled to have back here on the Rich Eisen Show, Al Michaels. How are you, Al?
I'm fine, all things considered. How are you, Rich?
I am doing well. And I just mentioned how unique it was for a so-called analyst to be the first voice of a broadcast as opposed to the play-by-play announcer. But I imagine that was in deference to Frank's time with the Monday Night Football booth, that he would be setting up the broadcast before handing it off to you.
Well, you know, Rich, I hadn't thought about this in years, but I'll tell you exactly what had happened. When Roone Arledge was the head of ABC Sports, and Roone was the man who obviously put Frank in that play-by-play role in 1971. And then when the company, ABC, was sold to Capital Cities, and Capital Cities took over in 1986, they brought Dennis Swanson in to run the sports department. And Dennis, I've described Dennis as a bull in a china shop. I mean, he was very strong-willed and strong-minded. And he said, hey, here's the deal. Michaels is going to do the play-by-play, and Gifford's going to be the analyst. And it was a shock to everybody. I mean, I was stunned. I had no idea that Dennis Swanson even knew me. I didn't even know Dennis at that point. And all of a sudden, he's my boss, and 2 days later, I'm the play-by-play announcer on Monday Night Football. And Frank was hesitant to take the analyst role because it was a shock to him. He hadn't done that. It almost looked as if, in Frank's eyes, it could be a bit of a demotion. So when all of this is coming down, there were a couple of other executives that were involved in this and making the transition. And I knew that Frank was upset about, having to move to a different role, it being perceived perhaps as a demotion, which it wasn't in my mind, but maybe in Frank's mind it was. And when we talked about how the show would open, I said, hey, I'm fine with the show continuing with Frank opening the show. And it's pretty much that's what took place. Because, I mean, Frank had been with Monday Night Football at that point for 15 seasons. People knew Frank. Here comes the new guy, me, who'd been doing, college football and Monday Night Baseball for many, many years. And I felt very strongly that Frank was the glue that held the show together, and it was no big deal to me to have Frank open up the show.
And in your comments last night, by the way, so poignant, so terrific, Al, where you had the stage and nationally televised stage the night that Frank passes away at the Hall of Fame of all places. The thing that leapt out at me in your comments were he was always the coolest guy in the room. And I'd love for you to put more detail on that, Al.
Well, I never saw Frank lose his temper. When Frank got mad or upset, he was quiet. We're in this business where there's a lot of knee-jerk stuff going on, and, all hell is breaking loose a lot of the time. And there's a tendency to lose your cool. We've all done it. But with Frank, it was as if he became calmer. And if you were like flying through turbulence, Frank was the guy you wanted to be at the controls of the plane. And I learned a lot from Frank in that regard because I just watched the way he would assess a situation, let it play out, let the waters become smoother, and roll with it. And as I say, I never saw Frank get to the point where he was yelling at anybody or was very upset in terms of having it manifested in his body language or the way he was going about things. The only times I really ever saw him get quite upset, he hated the fact that Chuck Bednarik had made a career out of talking about the fact that he had pulverized Frank Gifford. You saw that iconic black and white photo of Bednarik standing over the fallen Frank Gifford. Mm-hmm. And, of course, it cost Frank a year of his career. And that's the only time I saw a couple of occasions when Bednarik would do an interview and Frank would hear about it, and Bednarik is, dining out on knocking Frank Gifford out for a season. But, again, he would become very quiet. He'd let it, pass over, and he'd move on. I learned a lot from Frank in that regard.
Al Michaels joining me here on the Rich Eisen Show. What was his relationship with Howard Cosell and Dandy Don Meredith like, Al?
Well, he and Meredith were extremely close. with Cosell, Howard was a guy who coined the term jockocracy.
Mm-hmm.
He hated the fact that all of the former athletes were getting more and more prominent roles in television. And he did not like the fact that he felt that Frank was put in there because of his friendship with Roone. He could be very disparaging, Cosell, of Frank, and he was through the years. But he was that way, and I wrote about it in the book, where I said,
Yeah.
that's what Howard became. By the end of Howard's reign, he had flipped off everybody, and he had very few friends left at ABC. But I'll say one thing about Frank, and I was talking to Dan Patrick earlier today, and I said, here was Frank, who had been castigated both publicly and privately for a long time by Cosell. And when Cosell, left ABC in 1986 and went into, some sort of retirement apart from doing a radio show and sort of faded away, and nobody went to really visit Howard during that period of time before he died in 95. The one guy who went to see Howard when he got sick was Frank Gifford. Frank showed up at the door. So despite all that was going on and all of the things that Cosell had said to people about Frank, who goes to visit him when he's sick? Frank.
And it's interesting, too, that for folks who are hearing us, certainly from a different generation, Al, that there was a time in sports where a non-athlete was upset at the growing number of athletes who were entering the world of sports broadcasting that actually existed, because now the outlier absolutely would be somebody from outside the world of sports being placed in the role of a Monday Night Football booth, when you think about it.
Oh, sure. Well, the classic example, how about when we had Dennis Miller in there
Sure.
in 2000? And that was the all-time, going outside the box situation. But everything is more, obviously conventional these days with all the broadcast teams are pretty much comprised of the same types of broadcasters. You have the play-by-play man who kind of flies the plane, makes sure you get through the turbulence, and then the analyst does all of the the inside football stuff in a manner of speaking. So it was different. Monday night, and you talked about it, I know in the first hour how it kind of evolved. It was different. It was the first time that sports had been on primetime television, and it was Roone Arledge, putting together a threesome that was very different. You took a former player and made him a play-by-play man in the second year, and you mentioned that Keith Jackson had been the play-by-play man in the first season of the package, and then Frank comes in, and you've got Cosell, and there'd never been anybody in that role in the business prior to that, and then the folksy Don Meredith, who would come at it from a completely different angle. Mm-hmm. So it was different. It was unique. It helped to make the show the iconic program that it was, and it kind of in a way not reinvented but invented primetime sports television. And here we are. A lot of years later, and the vestiges of that still exist.
Al Michaels, the author of You Can't Make This Up, the book that you were referring to earlier here on The Rich Eisen Show. Before I let you go, Al, you are part of This Day in History, our This Day in History feature of today. Al, are you aware of what happened this day in history?
August the 10th.
It's okay. We could do it. Hold on. Before you even mention, here, Chris Law, you have the floor here on This Day in History with Al Michaels on the phone.
We're going to hit the time back machine to August 10th, 1981. You're at Veterans Stadium. Any clue there, maybe, as to...
Oh, could this be... Well, this is post-strike. They went on strike in June. Mm-hmm. They resumed play, and I'm beginning to think that Pete Rose may have set the National League record for most hits.
There we go.
Absolutely. He passed Stan Musial, Phillies
Right.
against the Cardinals with Stan in attendance. Let's hear a little bit of your call right here.
So Rose trying to break the tie with Musial. The strike one pitch to Rose. Bouncer to the hole. There it is. 3,631 to pass Musial. Next up, Aaron. If he stays healthy, that should come time next season.
Oh, he stayed healthy. That's for sure.
Do you have any recollections of that first inning where Pete had a hit that was ruled an error after they already sent off the fireworks in Veterans Stadium, and then he had to wait till the 8th inning?
Now that it's mentioned to me, yes, I do. And it was funny because that was, baseball was back. You had that, 6 or 7 week interlude.
Yeah, it was a 7-week strike.
Right, when the guys walked out. And, that's once in a while, you see that in a football game where they think somebody scores a touchdown and they set off the fireworks or shoot up the cannon or whatever. But, no, that was a very exciting night. It was great because I had done the Cincinnati Reds in the early 70s. I've said it before, Pete Rose, of all the athletes I've ever covered, I would rank him number one. I just, in terms of having to cover somebody, forget about what's gone on, post career and all of that. We know the Pete Rose story, but I loved Pete. I loved covering Pete because here was a guy who just went flat out 1,000%. Whether it was the 7th game of the World Series or the 8th inning of an exhibition game in Sarasota, Florida, loved covering him. And so, to be there on the night when he was able to establish a milestone in past damn music was a very exciting thing for me.
Al, you're 1 in a million. Thanks for calling in. Appreciate it.
Bye, guys. See you soon.
You bet. That's Al Michaels.
The Rich Eisen Show, weekdays at noon Eastern. On Audience.